I choose the back pew deliberately, where the shadows fall deepest and where I can slip away unnoticed if the weight of this charade becomes too much to bear. The church is packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the vestibule. Everyone has come to pay their respects to Father Thomas Mackenzie, the saint of St. Catherine's Home for Children, the man who supposedly dedicated his 63 years of life to saving orphan souls. My arthritic hands grip the worn leather of my purse so tightly that my knuckles have gone white. Inside that purse is a small photograph, yellowed with age, of a 12-year-old girl with hollow eyes and a forced smile. That girl was me, Margaret Whitmore, though back then I was Margaret Sullivan, and I had no idea that the man everyone is eulogizing today would nearly destroy everything good I might have become. The current priest at St. Mary speaks in reverent tones about Father Mackenzie's unwavering commitment to the most vulnerable among us. He recounts the statistics like a proud accountant: over 300 children housed at St. Catherine's during Mackenzie's tenure, countless lives transformed, millions of dollars raised for the orphanage through Mackenzie's tireless fundraising efforts. The congregation murmurs approval, dabbing at their eyes with tissues as they remember this pillar of their community. I scan the faces around me, wondering if any of them see what I see. Do they notice the small group of elderly people scattered throughout the pews, sitting alone, their faces carefully blank while everyone else nods and weeps? There's a man about my age 3 rows ahead, his jaw clenched so tight I can see the muscle jumping even from here. A woman near the side altar stares straight ahead, unblinking, her hands folded in her lap with the same white-knuckled grip I recognize in myself. We know each other without ever having met. We are the ones who lived through Father Mackenzie's special attention, his private lessons in his study after evening prayers, his midnight visits to our dormitory rooms. We are the ones who tried to tell, tried to warn, tried to run. We are the ones who learned that sometimes the wolf really does wear sheep's clothing, and sometimes the shepherd is the one the flock needs protection from. The mayor takes the podium next, his voice booming with political enthusiasm as he announces the city's plan to erect a bronze statue of Mackenzie in Memorial Park. Father Mackenzie represents the very best of our community, he declares, a man who saw children with no one to love them and made them his life's work. The applause thunders around me, and I feel sick enough that I have to press my hand to my mouth to keep from vomiting right here in the Lord's house. A former St. Catherine's resident, now a successful businessman, shares his testimony about how Mackenzie saved him from a life on the streets. He speaks about the warm meals, the clean clothes, the education that set him on the path to success. What he doesn't mention, what none of them ever mention, is why some children thrived under Mackenzie's care while others disappeared into themselves, why some were chosen for special privileges while others cowered in corners, why some of us ran away into winter storms rather than spend another night under that roof. I think about Lucy, my little roommate with the curly red hair and the stutter. She was only 8 when I escaped, and I still wake up some nights wondering what happened to her, wondering if my running away made things worse for the ones I left behind. I think about Robert, who tried to tell a visiting social worker what was happening and spent 3 days locked in the cellar as punishment. I think about Maria, who stopped speaking altogether after Mackenzie's attention turned to her, and who never spoke again even after she aged out of the system. As the service continues, I realize that every praise sung for this monster is another nail in the coffin of truth. Every donation made in his memory, every scholarship established in his name, every street they might name after him builds the myth higher and makes the reality of what he did to us seem more impossible, more unbelievable. But I am 78 years old, and I have spent 64 years carrying this secret like a stone in my chest. I have spent my entire adult life protecting other children, becoming a social worker, learning to spot the signs that other adults missed or ignored. I have saved dozens of children from situations like mine, but I have never saved myself from the weight of silence. The congregation rises for the final hymn, their voices lifted in celebration of a life they believe was well lived. I remain seated, my hands still clutching my purse, the photograph of that hollow-eyed girl burning against my palm like evidence waiting for its day in court. As they sing, I make a decision that has been building in me for decades. It may be too late for justice, but it's not too late for truth. And sometimes, when you've been silent for 64 years, truth is the only justice left. The silence in my apartment feels different tonight, heavier somehow, as if the weight of 64 years of unspoken words has finally become too much for these walls to contain. I sit in my reading chair, the same one I've occupied every evening for the past 15 years, but tonight the familiar comfort eludes me. The memorial service ended 3 hours ago, yet I can still hear the echo of that thunderous applause when the mayor announced the statue. My television drones in the background, the local news anchor's voice saccharine with false reverence as she recounts Mackenzie's inspiring legacy. They show footage of St. Catherine's from its heyday, children in neat uniforms waving at the camera, Mackenzie's arm draped protectively around their shoulders. I know that performance well. I was in similar photographs once, my smile practiced and empty, my eyes carefully vacant of any truth that might complicate the narrative. The camera lingers on Mackenzie's face, that same gentle expression I remember from childhood, the one that made adults trust him instantly. The same face that would change completely behind closed doors, becoming something cold and calculating, predatory in its focus. I reach for the remote with a shaking hand and silence his voice, but I cannot silence the memories it has awakened. My living room tells the story of a life spent in service to others. The walls are lined with certificates of appreciation from the Department of Children and Family Services, photos of me with foster families I helped unite, letters from social workers I mentored over my 40-year career. A lifetime of protecting other people's children because I couldn't protect myself or the children I left behind at St. Catherine's. In the corner stands my desk, where I've written countless reports documenting abuse, neglect, and trauma. I've become an expert in recognizing the signs, in listening to what children don't say as much as what they do. I've sat across from judges and lawyers, advocating for children who had no voice, fighting systems that would rather maintain comfortable lies than confront ugly truths. Yet I have never written the most important report of my life, the one about what happened to me. I walk to my desk and pull out the manila folder I've kept locked in the bottom drawer for decades. Inside are newspaper clippings about St. Catherine's, about Mackenzie's various honors and accolades, about the children who thrived under his care. Also inside is that photograph from my purse, the one of 12-year-old me, along with a few other mementos I managed to keep from those dark years. A prayer card Mackenzie gave me after one of his visits, with his handwriting on the back that makes my skin crawl even now. A letter from Mrs. Morrison, the foster mother who first believed my story and gave me the courage to heal. My phone sits silent on the desk beside these artifacts of my past. Dr. Sarah Chen's number is programmed into it, the woman who has been my therapist for 23 years, who helped me understand that surviving wasn't something to be ashamed of, that my hypervigilance and inability to trust weren't character flaws but trauma responses. Sarah knows my story better than anyone living, and she's the only person who might understand the decision I'm contemplating. The news program has moved on to weather and traffic, but I know tomorrow will bring more coverage of Mackenzie's wonderful life. There will be planning committees for the statue, fundraising drives for the memorial scholarship in his name, perhaps even a movement to have him considered for sainthood. Each accolade will make the truth seem more impossible, more like the delusions of a bitter old woman than the reality of systematic abuse. I think about the other faces I saw in that church today, the ones who sat too still, who didn't applaud, who knew what I knew but carried it in the same suffocating silence. How many of us are there? How many children did Mackenzie damage during his decades at St. Catherine's? How many of us grew up believing we were the only ones, that our pain was somehow unique and shameful? My hands tremble as I reach for the phone. It's nearly 10 o'clock, but Sarah has told me countless times that I can call her anytime, especially when the memories become overwhelming. Tonight, they're not just overwhelming, they're demanding action. For the first time in my life, I'm angrier about the injustice than I am afraid of the consequences of speaking out. The phone rings twice before Sarah's calm, familiar voice answers. Margaret? Are you all right? I went to his memorial service today, I say without preamble, my voice steadier than I expected. They're going to build a statue of him, Sarah. A bronze statue in the park where children play. There's a pause, and I can almost hear Sarah's mind working, understanding immediately what this means for me. How are you feeling about that? I'm feeling like 64 years of silence is long enough, I say, the words surprising me with their clarity. I'm feeling like maybe it's time to tell the truth about Father Thomas Mackenzie, no matter who doesn't want to hear it. The silence stretches between us, but it's not empty. It's full of possibilities, full of a courage I didn't know I still possessed. When Sarah speaks again, her voice carries both compassion and determination. Then let's talk about how we're going to do that. I was 12 years old when the social worker first drove me through the wrought iron gates of St. Catherine's Home for Children, and I had never seen anything so beautiful in my young life. The building rose before us like something from a fairy tale, all red brick and white columns, with perfectly manicured gardens stretching across emerald lawns. After 3 weeks of sleeping in state facilities with their institutional green walls and fluorescent lighting, St. Catherine's looked like salvation itself. The social worker, Mrs. Patterson, had prepared me during the drive by explaining how lucky I was to be placed here. Father Mackenzie personally reviews every application, she said, her voice filled with reverence. He only accepts children he feels he can truly help. You should feel honored, Margaret. Some children wait years for a spot at St. Catherine's. I pressed my nose against the car window, watching other children play on swings that looked brand new. They wore crisp uniforms, navy blue jumpers for the girls, and their laughter carried across the grounds like music. After the accident that took my parents, after standing alone at their funeral, after the cold efficiency of the state system, this place promised the warmth and belonging I desperately craved. Mrs. Patterson led me up the front steps, past flowering bushes that perfumed the air with sweetness. The heavy wooden doors opened into a foyer that took my breath away. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across polished marble floors. Religious paintings lined the walls, their subjects gazing down with expressions that made me feel watched over and protected. That's when I first saw him. Father Mackenzie emerged from his office, moving with gentle authority that made everyone in his presence feel special. He was younger then, in his early 40s, with kind eyes and graying hair that made him look distinguished. His smile was warm and genuine, the kind that reached his eyes and made you want to smile back. "And you must be Margaret," he said, extending his hand to me with the same respect he would show an adult. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. I'm Father Mackenzie, and I want you to know that St. Catherine's is your home now, for as long as you need it." His voice was like honey, smooth and sweet, with just a hint of an Irish accent that made him sound like the priests in movies. When he shook my hand, his touch was gentle but firm, and he looked directly into my eyes as he spoke. No adult had given me that kind of focused attention since my parents died. I felt warmth spread through my chest, the first real comfort I'd experienced in weeks. Mrs. Patterson beamed beside me, clearly proud to have facilitated this placement. "Father Mackenzie has been caring for children here for 15 years, she told me. He has quite a reputation for helping troubled young people find their way. Every child who comes to us brings their own unique gifts," Father Mackenzie said, still holding my hand. "I can already tell that Margaret is going to be very special here. Aren't you, dear?" I nodded eagerly, wanting desperately to be special to someone again, to matter to an adult who would care about my nightmares and fears. The grief from losing my parents had left a hollow ache in my chest, and Father Mackenzie's attention felt like the beginning of healing. He gave me a personal tour of the facilities, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder as he guided me through hallways lined with photographs of smiling children and newspaper articles praising his work. We passed the library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the art room with its easels and supplies, the dining hall with long tables set with real china rather than institutional plastic. Everything was perfect, clean, and welcoming. "We believe in treating our children with dignity," Father Mackenzie explained as we walked. "You're not charity cases here, you're family." My family. The dormitory was bright and cheerful, with flowered bedspreads and curtained windows that looked out over the gardens. My bed was already made, with a small stuffed rabbit sitting on the pillow. Father Mackenzie noticed my surprise and smiled. "I thought you might like a friend," he said. "Every child needs something to hold on to when the nights get difficult." Other children gathered around us as we toured, and they all spoke of Father Mackenzie with obvious affection. They called him Father Mac and competed for his attention, eager to show him their artwork or share stories about their day. He remembered details about each of them, asking about test scores and friendships with personal interest that made them glow. That first evening, as I sat in the common room watching television with the other children, I felt something I hadn't felt since the accident: hope. Here was a place where I could heal, where I could become part of a real family again. Father Mackenzie checked on me before bedtime, sitting on the edge of my bed to ask how I was settling in. "Are you happy here, Margaret?" he asked, and his concern seemed so genuine that tears sprang to my eyes. "Yes, Father," I whispered. "Thank you for letting me stay." He reached out and brushed the tears from my cheek with his thumb, his touch gentle and comforting. "You're going to do wonderful things here," he said. "I can see great potential in you. We're going to help you reach it." As I drifted off to sleep that night, clutching my new stuffed rabbit and listening to the quiet breathing of my roommates, I believed I had finally found my sanctuary. I had no way of knowing that I had actually walked into the most dangerous place I would ever live. Part 4: The Grooming Process. The first sign that I was special to Father Mackenzie came 3 weeks after my arrival, though at the time I felt nothing but gratitude for his attention. While the other children went to their afternoon recreation period, he asked me to stay behind to help him organize books in his private study. I felt chosen, important, like I had finally found an adult who saw something worthwhile in the broken girl who had lost everything. His study was different from the rest of St. Catherine's. Where the common areas were bright and cheerful, designed for public viewing, his office felt intimate and personal. Heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, and the walls were lined with theological books and personal photographs. A large wooden desk dominated the space, with 2 leather chairs positioned in front of it. He gestured for me to sit in one while he settled into the chair beside me, closer than a teacher would sit, close enough that I could smell his cologne. "You know, Margaret, you remind me of myself at your age," he said, his voice soft and conspiratorial. "I lost my parents when I was young too. I understand the loneliness you're feeling, the way it sits in your chest like a stone." I nodded, surprised that this important man would share something so personal with me. None of the adults at the state facility had ever spoken to me about feelings, let alone shared their own experiences. Father Mackenzie reached over and took my hand in both of his skin warm and dry. "The other children here, they don't understand what real loss feels like," he continued. "They were abandoned or neglected, but they never knew true love and then had it torn away. You and I, we're different. We know what it means to have everything and then lose it all." His words made perfect sense to my grieving 12-year-old mind. I did feel different from the other children, older somehow, marked by a pain they couldn't comprehend. When he spoke to me like this, I felt understood in a way I hadn't since my parents died. These private meetings became a regular occurrence. 2 or 3 times a week, Father Mackenzie would single me out for special tasks that required his personal attention. Sometimes we organized his library, sometimes we discussed my schoolwork, and sometimes we simply talked about my feelings and my past. He was the first adult to ask me detailed questions about my parents, to want to hear stories about my life before the accident. "Tell me about your father," he would say, leaning forward with genuine interest. "What did he smell like when he hugged you? How did your mother tuck you in at night?" These conversations made me cry, but Father Mackenzie assured me that crying was healthy, that I needed to release my grief to heal properly. He would hold my hand while I cried, sometimes pulling me closer for what he called therapeutic comfort. He explained that physical affection was essential for traumatized children, that my body needed to relearn how to trust and accept love. "The other staff members here mean well," he told me one afternoon as I sat curled in his lap while he stroked my hair, "but they don't understand trauma the way I do. They think boundaries and professional distance are what you need, but that's exactly the opposite of what helps a child like you heal. I believed him completely. His attention felt like medicine for the aching loneliness that had consumed me since my parents' death. When he held me, when he listened to my stories, when he told me I was brave and special and deserving of love, the constant pain in my chest would ease just a little. He began giving me small privileges that set me apart from the other children. I was allowed to stay up later than the others, to have seconds at dinner, to choose the television program on Sunday evenings. He explained that these special treatments were because I was mature for my age, because I had earned his trust through my good behavior and our deep conversations. The other children wouldn't understand, he said. They might feel jealous or left out if they knew about our special relationship. It's better if we keep our talks private, just between us. The secrecy felt natural, even protective. I didn't want to share Father Mackenzie's attention with anyone else, and I certainly didn't want the other children to be jealous of what I had found. He made me feel like I was the most important person in his world, like he cared about me in a way that was deeper and more meaningful than his relationships with the other children. When he started asking me to help him with tasks in his private quarters, I felt honored to be trusted with such responsibility. When our conversations moved from his study to his bedroom, when he began talking about different kinds of love and different ways of showing care, when his touches began to linger and change, I accepted it all as part of his special care for me. I had no framework for understanding manipulation or grooming. I only knew that this important, respected man had chosen me, had seen something valuable in me when I felt worthless and alone. In my desperate need for love and belonging, I mistook possession for affection, isolation for intimacy, and violation for care. The child I had been, the one who trusted adults and believed in goodness, began to disappear during those private sessions. But I wouldn't understand what I was losing until it was already gone. By the time I turned 13, the special attention that had once made me feel chosen had become something I dreaded with every fiber of my being. The gentle man who had welcomed me to St. Catherine's had revealed himself to be someone else entirely behind the locked door of his private quarters. What he called love, my body screamed was wrong. What he insisted was healing felt like destruction. I had stopped crying during our sessions because tears only seemed to excite him more. Instead, I learned to disappear inside my own mind, to float somewhere near the ceiling and watch what was happening to my body as if it belonged to someone else. He would whisper about how special I was, how mature, how this was our secret way of caring for each other that no one else would understand. "This is what love looks like, Margaret," he would say afterward, smoothing my hair while I lay frozen beside him. "This is how people who truly care for each other express their deepest feelings. Your parents loved each other this way." The mention of my parents always made something inside me recoil violently. I knew with absolute certainty that what my parents had shared bore no resemblance to what Father Mackenzie did to me in the darkness of his room. But I was 13 years old, trapped and dependent on him for everything, and he was a respected adult whose word carried the weight of divine authority. The breaking point came when Mrs. Henderson, the art teacher who visited St. Catherine's twice a week, noticed something wrong. I had always loved drawing, but my artwork had grown dark and disturbing. Where I once drew flowers and houses with happy families, I now sketched shadowy figures and children with hollow, frightened eyes. "Margaret, honey, is everything all right at home?" Mrs. Henderson asked one Tuesday afternoon, using the word home the way adults always did when referring to St. Catherine's. She knelt beside my desk, her voice gentle with concern. "Your drawings seem troubled lately." Something about her kindness broke through the wall I had built around my feelings. Before I could stop myself, words began tumbling out. Not the whole truth, because I didn't have language for what Father Mackenzie did to me, but fragments of it. I told her about the private meetings, about how Father Mackenzie said I was special, about how our relationship had to be secret. Mrs. Henderson's face grew serious as she listened. She asked careful questions, and I answered as honestly as I could, watching hope bloom in my chest for the first time in months. Here was an adult who seemed to understand that something was wrong, who might be able to help me. I'm going to talk to Father Mackenzie about this, she said finally, squeezing my hand. You did the right thing by telling me, Margaret. Adults are supposed to protect children, not make them feel confused or uncomfortable. I felt lighter that day than I had in months. Someone finally knew. Someone was going to help. I went to bed that night actually looking forward to the next day, imagining a future where I wouldn't have to dread Father Mackenzie's summons to his office. But Father Mackenzie was smarter than I had given him credit for. When Mrs. Henderson spoke to him, he was ready. He met with her privately in his office, the same office where he had first begun grooming me, and when she emerged an hour later, her entire demeanor toward me had changed. The next Tuesday, Mrs. Henderson avoided my eyes. When I approached her after class, hoping to hear that my nightmare was over, she looked at me with a mixture of pity and distrust that made my stomach turn. Margaret, Father Mackenzie explained to me about your difficulties adjusting since losing your parents, she said, her voice careful and distant. He told me that you sometimes have trouble distinguishing between appropriate adult care and other things. He's very concerned about you. The words hit me like physical blows. I tried to protest, to explain that wasn't true, but Mrs. Henderson held up her hand to stop me. Father Mackenzie has devoted his life to helping children like you, she continued. He's trained in trauma counseling and child psychology. I think perhaps you've misunderstood his attempts to help you heal from your grief. I watched my last hope crumble as Mrs. Henderson walked away, leaving me standing alone in the art room surrounded by my dark drawings. Father Mackenzie had painted me as a damaged, confused child whose trauma made her imagine inappropriate things. His reputation was unassailable, his word gospel truth, while I was just another troubled orphan acting out. That night, Father Mackenzie summoned me to his office with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I understand you've been having some confused thoughts lately, he said, closing the door behind me with a soft click. Mrs. Henderson was very concerned about you. She thinks you need more intensive therapy to help you work through your grief. What followed was worse than anything that had come before. He was angry now, no longer gentle or patient. He made it clear that speaking out had consequences, that my word would never be believed over his, that I was completely powerless in this place that everyone else saw as a sanctuary. No one will ever believe you, he whispered as he hurt me in ways that made me understand why some children at St. Catherine's never spoke at all. I am a man of God. You are a disturbed little girl. If you ever try to tell anyone again, I'll make sure you're sent somewhere much worse than this. From that night forward, I never spoke another word about what Father Mackenzie did to me. I learned that silence was survival, that hope was dangerous, and that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the very ones you need protection from. I learned that truth was less powerful than reputation, and that being believed was a luxury I would never be able to afford. I was 13 years old, and I had learned that I was utterly alone in the world. I had been at St. Catherine's for nearly 2 years when Lucy arrived, and the moment I saw her clutching a worn teddy bear with one missing eye, I felt something crack open inside my chest that I thought had been sealed forever. She was only 8 years old, small for her age, with wild red curls that refused to stay in the regulation braids and a stutter that got worse when adults spoke to her. She looked exactly like I must have looked when I first walked through those gates, hopeful and desperate for someone to love her. They assigned her to my dormitory room, the same room where I now spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling and counting the hours until morning would make me safe again. Lucy climbed into the bed that had once been occupied by Sarah, a quiet girl who had aged out of the system 6 months earlier. I watched Lucy arrange her few possessions in the small dresser drawer, her movements careful and reverent, as if she couldn't quite believe she was allowed to have a space of her own. "Is it nice here?" she asked me that first night, her voice barely above a whisper in the darkness. "The lady who brought me said Father Mackenzie is really good with children who have nowhere else to go." I felt nauseous at her words, at the innocence in her voice, at the trust she was already placing in this institution that had destroyed everything good inside me. I wanted to warn her, to tell her to run before it was too late, but Father Mackenzie's words echoed in my mind, no one would ever believe me. If I couldn't save myself, how could I possibly save her? It's okay, I managed to say, the lie burning my throat. Just stay close to the other kids. Don't go anywhere alone. But even as I said it, I knew my warning wouldn't be enough. Lucy was exactly the type of child Father Mackenzie preferred, young, vulnerable, starving for adult attention and approval. Within a week, he had already begun singling her out for small privileges, praising her artwork in front of the other children, asking her to help him with special tasks. I watched it happening with the helpless horror of someone witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Every kind word he spoke to Lucy, every gentle touch on her shoulder, every private conversation behind his office door felt like reliving my own destruction all over again. I tried to insert myself between them whenever possible, volunteering for tasks he had asked Lucy to do, creating distractions when he called for her during free time. "Why are you being so mean to me?" Lucy asked one afternoon after I had convinced her to stay in the library instead of going to Father Mackenzie's office. "Father Mac says I'm special, that I remind him of an angel. Why don't you want him to like me?" I stared at her small, hopeful face and felt something break inside me that I hadn't even realized was still intact. She was using the same tone I had once used, the same desperate gratitude for scraps of adult attention. I was watching my own nightmare begin again in a new victim, and I was powerless to stop it. That night, I lay awake listening to Lucy's peaceful breathing and made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I couldn't save Lucy by staying. The system was rigged, the adults were either complicit or willfully blind, and my voice would never be loud enough to overcome Father Mackenzie's reputation. But if I escaped, if I could get to the outside world and find someone who would listen, maybe I could bring help back for her and all the other children. I began planning my escape with the methodical precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. I studied the staff schedules, noting when shifts changed and which doors were left unmonitored. I hoarded food from meals, hiding crackers and fruit in my pillowcase. I stole small items that might be useful, a screwdriver from the maintenance closet, a flashlight from the supply room, extra socks and underwear that I layered beneath my regular clothes. The window in the storage room on the third floor had a broken latch that no one had bothered to repair. I worked on loosening it further during the times I was supposed to be in study hall, picking at the wood with my stolen screwdriver until I could push it open wide enough to squeeze through. Beyond the window was the slanted roof of the kitchen extension, and beyond that, freedom. The hardest part was keeping my plans secret from Lucy. She had begun looking to me for guidance and protection, following me around like a lost puppy, and I knew she would want to come with me. But an 8-year-old would slow me down, make noise at the wrong moment, leave tracks that would help them find us faster. If I was going to save her, I had to abandon her first. 3 weeks before I turned 15, Father Mackenzie summoned Lucy to his private quarters for the first time. She returned to our room 2 hours later, her eyes glazed with the same confused shame I recognized from my own reflection. She climbed into her bed without speaking, curling around her teddy bear like it was the only solid thing left in the world. I watched her silent tears soak into her pillow, and I knew I was out of time. Tomorrow night, when the winter storm that had been forecast finally hit, I would make my escape. I would run through the snow and darkness, and I would find help, and I would come back for Lucy and all the others. I just had to survive the guilt of leaving her behind long enough to save us all. The blizzard arrived on a Tuesday night in February, just as the weather forecast had promised, with winds that howled around St. Catherine's like the voices of all the children who had never been heard. I lay in my narrow bed listening to the storm build, feeling my heart pound so hard I was certain it would wake Lucy in the bed beside me. She had been different since that first night in Father Mackenzie's quarters 3 weeks ago, quieter and more withdrawn, jumping at sudden sounds and flinching when adults approached her. I waited until the dormitory supervisor made her final rounds at midnight, then counted another hour to be sure everyone was deeply asleep. The storm was perfect cover, loud enough to mask any sounds I might make and severe enough that no one would expect a child to venture outside. I slipped from my bed wearing every piece of clothing I owned, my stolen supplies tucked into pillowcases tied around my waist beneath my coat. Moving through St. Catherine's corridors in the darkness felt like navigating a haunted house where I knew all the ghosts personally. These halls had witnessed my destruction, had echoed with my silent screams, had absorbed the tears I thought I had no more left to cry. Every step toward the storage room felt like walking away from my own grave. The window I had been working to loosen for weeks finally gave way with a soft creak that made me freeze in terror, listening for any sound of discovery. But the storm continued to rage outside, and the building remained silent around me. The opening looked impossibly small now that I needed to fit through it, and the drop to the kitchen roof below seemed much farther than it had during my daytime reconnaissance. The wind hit me like a physical blow when I squeezed through the window, instantly numbing my face and stealing my breath. Snow stung my eyes and filled my mouth, and I realized with growing panic that I had vastly underestimated the severity of the storm. But there was no going back now. Father Mackenzie would notice my absence at morning headcount, and my window of opportunity would close forever. I lowered myself onto the kitchen roof, my fingers already so cold I could barely feel them. The metal surface was slick with ice, and I nearly slipped twice before managing to work my way to the edge. The final drop to the ground was only about 8 feet, but in the howling wind and blinding snow, it felt like jumping into an abyss. I landed hard in a snowdrift that came up to my chest, the impact driving the breath from my lungs and sending sharp pain through my ankle. For a moment I lay there gasping, overwhelmed by the realization that I was actually outside, that I had broken free from the prison that had held me for nearly 3 years. But celebration was a luxury I couldn't afford yet. The trudge through the grounds toward the main gate was a nightmare of exhaustion and cold. The snow was deeper than I had anticipated, and the wind kept changing direction, disorienting me until I wasn't sure I was even heading the right way. My stolen flashlight was useless in the whiteout conditions, and I had to feel my way along the wrought iron fence that surrounded the property. When I finally reached the road, my legs were shaking with fatigue and cold, and I could no longer feel my hands or feet. The highway stretched empty in both directions, a ribbon of white disappearing into the storm. I had gambled everything on finding help, but now I wondered if I would freeze to death before anyone found me. I started walking toward what I hoped was town, stumbling through knee-deep snow along the roadside. My lungs burned with each breath of frigid air, and ice crystals formed on my eyelashes, making it even harder to see. I began to understand that I might die out here, that my escape might simply trade one form of destruction for another. The truck's headlights appeared through the storm like twin angels, and I stumbled into the road waving my arms frantically. The 18-wheeler came to a grinding halt just feet from where I stood, its air brakes hissing like some mechanical dragon. "Jesus Christ, kid, what are you doing out here?" The driver was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a beard full of snow. He pulled me up into the warm cab, and I collapsed onto the passenger seat, shaking uncontrollably as feeling began to return to my extremities. "I ran away," I managed to say through chattering teeth. "From St. Catherine's. I need help." The driver, whose nameplate read, Mike, wrapped a blanket around me and handed me a thermos of coffee that burned my throat and tasted like salvation. "St. Catherine's? That's the orphanage with the priest everyone loves, right? Father something." "Father Mackenzie," I whispered, and something in my voice must have warned him not to ask more questions yet. "All right, kid. Let's get you somewhere warm and safe, and then we'll figure out what to do next." As Mike's truck pulled away from St. Catherine's, carrying me toward an uncertain but hopeful future, I pressed my face to the window and looked back at the building that had been my prison. Somewhere inside those walls, Lucy was sleeping, unaware that I had abandoned her to save us both. The guilt of leaving her behind was a weight I would carry for the rest of my life, but I had made my choice. I was free, and for the first time in years, I was going to live to see morning. The Morrison family lived in a 2-story colonial house with yellow shutters and a front porch swing that creaked in the summer breeze. After 6 months bouncing between emergency shelters and temporary placements, their home felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Mrs. Morrison met me at the door with flour-dusted hands and a smile that reached her eyes, the kind of genuine warmth I had almost forgotten existed. "Welcome home, Margaret," she said, and something about the way she used the word home made my throat tighten with emotions I wasn't ready to feel yet. Sarah Morrison had been an elementary school teacher for 30 years before retiring to focus on foster care. She had a gift for reading the silences between words, for understanding the language of trauma that children carried in their bodies. During my first weeks with the Morrisons, she never pushed me to talk about my past, never asked direct questions about why I flinched when Mr. Morrison raised his voice during football games or why I couldn't bear to be alone in a room with him. Instead, she created space for me to exist without explanation. She showed me where the extra blankets were kept, in case I got cold during the night. She left my bedroom door slightly ajar and kept a small lamp burning in the hallway so I would never wake up in complete darkness. She never made me explain why I hoarded food in my dresser drawer or why I sometimes startled when she touched my shoulder. It was during my 3rd month with them that the walls I had built around my memories began to crack. I was helping Mrs. Morrison prepare dinner when a news report came on the television about another child abuse case at a different institution. The reporter was interviewing a social worker who spoke about the difficulty of getting children to come forward, how trauma often made them unable to articulate their experiences. "Those poor babies," Mrs. Morrison murmured, shaking her head as she stirred the soup. "The ones who suffer in silence are the ones that break my heart the most. They think no one will believe them." Something in her voice, the genuine sorrow and understanding, made my carefully constructed defenses crumble. Before I could stop myself, words began pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. "They wouldn't have believed me either," I whispered, my hands shaking as I set down the spoon I had been holding. "I tried to tell someone, but he was too important, too respected." Mrs. Morrison turned off the burner and sat down beside me at the kitchen table, her movements slow and deliberate, giving me space to continue or stop as I needed. "Who wouldn't have believed you, sweetheart?" The story came out in fragments over the following weeks, pieces of truth I shared during quiet moments when my defenses were down. I told her about Father Mackenzie's special attention, about the private meetings in his study, about the way he made me feel chosen and important before he began hurting me in ways I still didn't have adequate words to describe. Mrs. Morrison never interrupted, never questioned the details, never asked why I hadn't fought harder or run sooner. She simply listened with the kind of attention that made me feel like my words mattered, like my pain was real and valid regardless of how much time had passed. "I believe you," she said after I finished telling her about my failed attempt to get help from Mrs. Henderson, the art teacher who had dismissed my concerns after speaking with Father Mackenzie. "I believe every word you've told me, and I want you to know that what happened to you was not your fault. Not any of it." Those words, "I believe you," hit me with more force than I had expected. No adult had ever said them to me before. For so long, I had carried the weight of Father Mackenzie's insistence that I was confused, disturbed, that my memories were products of trauma-induced delusion. Hearing someone acknowledge my truth felt like being given permission to exist fully for the first time in years. When Mrs. Morrison suggested we report what had happened to the authorities, I felt the familiar surge of panic that had kept me silent for so long. "They won't believe me," I said, echoing Father Mackenzie's words. "He's too respected. Everyone loves him." But Mrs. Morrison was not everyone. She was a retired teacher who had spent decades advocating for children, and she understood how systems failed vulnerable kids. She also understood that my healing didn't depend on whether the authorities took action, but on whether I was able to speak my truth and be heard. We made the report together, sitting in a sterile office while I recounted my story to a detective who took careful notes but whose expression grew increasingly skeptical when I mentioned Father Mackenzie's name. Just as I had feared, the investigation went nowhere. St. Catherine's reputation was unassailable, and I was just another troubled foster child with a history of running away. But something important had changed. I had spoken my truth aloud to people who believed me, and the sky had not fallen. Father Mackenzie's power over me, his ability to silence me through shame and fear, had begun to crack. Mrs. Morrison helped me understand that justice and healing were not the same thing, that I could begin to recover even if the legal system failed me. For the first time since arriving at St. Catherine's as a broken 12-year-old, I began to believe that I might survive not just physically, but emotionally. I had found my voice, and though the world might not be ready to hear it yet, I was finally ready to use it. I graduated high school with no fanfare, no family in the bleachers, no one holding a bouquet of flowers for me at the bottom of the steps. But Mrs. Morrison had ironed my dress and hugged me afterward, and that small moment of normalcy felt like something I could hold on to. She and her husband stayed in my life longer than the system required, helping me apply to college, filling out financial aid forms I didn't understand, driving me to campus tours in their battered sedan. It was Mrs. Morrison who first said the words that would shape everything I did from that point forward. "You see the invisible ones, Margaret. Maybe because you once were one." I chose social work not because it felt noble, but because it felt necessary. I didn't want to fix the system, I didn't believe it could be fixed, but I wanted to be the adult I had once needed. I wanted to be the person who believed the quiet kids with hollow eyes and practiced lies. My trauma didn't make me idealistic. It made me exacting. I approached every child welfare case with the urgency of someone who had once screamed in silence. When I sat across from children in shelters, or in courtrooms, or in temporary foster homes, I didn't need them to articulate what was wrong. I could read the stiffness in their posture, the way they flinched when I praised them, the way their eyes scanned the room for exits. I saw myself in all of them. By the time I was 25, I was already supervising caseworkers who were 10 years older than me. I was meticulous, sometimes to a fault. I documented everything. I took photos, recorded timestamps, wrote reports so detailed they read like memoirs. Judges listened to me because I didn't appeal to sentiment. I built cases like an architect builds a bridge, with facts so interconnected that no one could ignore the child standing at the center. Still, I rarely spoke about St. Catherine's. Even among my colleagues, even with Sarah Chen when I eventually met her, I never offered more than vague references to a bad institution or a failed placement. The full truth remained sealed inside me like a locked room. Love was harder. Relationships came and went, but intimacy always hit a wall I couldn't dismantle. The men I dated called me guarded, distant, emotionally unavailable. They weren't wrong. When someone touched me unexpectedly, even kindly, my body still flinched before my mind could catch up. Sex felt clinical, something I endured rather than enjoyed, and the moment anyone asked what I was thinking, my answer was always a carefully constructed lie. I told myself that being alone was safer, simpler. That some of us weren't meant to be held too tightly. Still, there were moments of peace. I found it in late-night phone calls with foster kids who had aged out but still wanted to talk. In letters from teenagers I'd helped place into homes where they learned to trust again. In visits to college campuses with a young woman who once arrived to our agency with bruises and now wanted to study law. Those were the moments when I felt whole, not healed, exactly, but purposeful. I told myself that was enough. But in the quiet hours, on holidays I spent alone, or when certain names came up in church bulletins, or when I heard a girl laugh in a register that reminded me of Lucy, my mind would return to St. Catherine's. I wondered where she was. Whether she had survived. Whether she hated me for leaving. I didn't know how to forgive myself, even as I built a life helping children I could actually save. The truth was, I had become very good at rescuing others because I never figured out how to rescue the parts of myself that were still trapped in that red brick building. When I turned 30, Mrs. Morrison gave me a quilt she had been secretly stitching for years. Each square was embroidered with a word: courage, truth, safety, home. I cried when I saw the final patch, stitched in soft blue thread, read, believed. She didn't ask what the tears were for. She just held my hand and said, "You don't need to explain. Some stories speak without words." Some names never leave you. Not even after 30 years, 2 apartment moves, a half-dozen lost friendships, and a retirement plaque engraved with words like dedication and compassion. I didn't keep in touch with anyone from St. Catherine's, but that didn't mean I forgot them. In quiet corners of my mind, they lived like ghosts who never aged, Lucy with her tangled curls and downcast eyes, Robert with that bitter jaw clench even as a boy, Maria whose silence had been more deafening than any scream. I never dared look them up. What would I say if I found them? I tried. I'm sorry. Some debts cannot be repaid in words. Sometimes, though, life has a way of folding back in on itself. A girl I once helped through a difficult placement told me in a hushed voice that her group home supervisor used to work at St. Catherine's back in the 70s. I felt my breath catch, though I said nothing. I had mastered that by then, keeping my reactions buried just beneath the surface, calm as still water. Later, in private, I called in a favor and pulled the man's personnel file. There it was in black ink: former residential staff, St. Catherine's Home for Children, 1971 to 1976. I sat with that folder in my lap for a long time, staring at the line as though it might change under the weight of my gaze. Eventually, I made sure he never worked with children again. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. Over the years, I began to notice the pattern. Occasionally, a name would resurface, on a grant application, in an alumni newsletter, in the footnote of a research study on childhood trauma. It always sent a current through my body. Others had survived too, and some had even stepped into roles like mine: social work, therapy, education. We were everywhere, it seemed, survivors hiding in plain sight, pouring ourselves into the protection of others while never quite daring to protect ourselves. But whenever we crossed paths, even unknowingly, there was always a flicker of something. A too long pause in conversation. A glance that lingered. A silence that didn't feel empty. We knew each other, even if we didn't say it aloud. Not everyone made it. I knew that too. One spring, I received a case file on a man in his 50s who had died from an overdose in a halfway house. The intake report mentioned a history in institutional care, and when I saw the line, St. Catherine's, 1965 to 1969, my heart stuttered. His name was Jeremy. I remembered him vaguely, a lanky, nervous boy who always seemed to hover near the edge of things. I hadn't known him well, but the knowledge that he had carried those years all the way into addiction and death sat with me for days. I didn't tell anyone why I wept that week. There was no point. Time passed, but the weight of those years never did. It simply changed shape. Sometimes it arrived as guilt, sudden and sharp, like when I overheard colleagues joke about overdramatic foster kids, or when someone praised the Catholic Church's rich history of compassion. Sometimes it was grief, quiet and persistent, like the ache in old bones when the weather shifts. And sometimes, rarely, it came as anger. Not the kind that burned hot, but the slow, grinding kind that made me grip the edges of my desk when someone dared to say, "I bet St. Catherine saved a lot of kids." I never told anyone what really happened to me. Not then. Not fully. I feared the disbelief more than the judgment. I had seen what happened to girls who told. How their memories were dissected, their motives questioned, their pain reinterpreted through the lens of whatever made the abuser more convenient to believe. I told myself my silence was survival. That it didn't matter anymore. That I had done more good by staying quiet and working within the system than I ever could have done by shouting into a storm no one wanted to acknowledge. But sometimes, in the early hours of the morning when the city was still and the only sound was the hum of my refrigerator, I would imagine the lives we might have had if someone had listened. I imagined Lucy in college, her curls pulled back, laughing with real joy. I imagined Robert as a teacher, standing before a chalkboard without the weight of unspeakable memories dragging on his spine. I imagined myself in a family photo, not the ghost on the edge of someone else's story. And I would wonder, not bitterly, just curiously, what it would have felt like to be a child who was simply allowed to be one. I kept the photograph of 12-year-old me in the drawer by my bed. I couldn't bear to display it, but I couldn't throw it away either. Sometimes, when the world felt too loud, would take it out and look at her eyes, wide and hollow, pretending not to see what was right in front of her. I wanted to reach through time and whisper to her, "You weren't wrong. You weren't broken. And someday, someone will believe you." But most days, I just folded it back up and returned it to the dark. I hadn't planned to attend the memorial. I told myself I was too old, too tired, too distant from all of that. But when I saw the obituary in the paper, I folded it neatly and slid it under my calendar, as if that would stop the words from echoing. Reverend Father Thomas F. Mackenzie, beloved founder of St. Catherine's Home for Children, passed peacefully in his sleep. The city would mourn a saint. I knew that before I walked through the church doors. Still, I walked in. Still, I sat in the last pew and let the weight of my silence sit beside me like an old companion. They spoke of him as if he were Christ himself. The mayor, the bishop, even a grown man who claimed Mackenzie had saved him from a life of crime. No one mentioned the children who disappeared inward after meeting Mackenzie. No one spoke the names of those who didn't graduate, who didn't thrive, who didn't smile for the cameras. The sanctuary buzzed with reverence, and I felt something between fury and nausea rise in my throat. I wondered if they would name a school after him. A library. A scholarship fund. Or worse, a statue. Children would run past it, climb its feet, touch his outstretched hands without knowing what those hands had done. I scanned the pews, wondering if I was the only ghost in the room. But then I saw them, faces aged by time, but marked by something deeper. A woman near the side wall with her hands folded tight, eyes fixed on nothing. A man in a dark coat, his shoulders rigid, not a single tear shed. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. There is a language between survivors that does not require words. We see the same invisible cracks in each other, the ones no amount of therapy or distance can fully mend. After the service, I lingered near the church steps, not ready to re-enter a world that was now eulogizing a predator. That's when I saw him, Robert. He was older, of course. We all were. But I knew him instantly. He walked like he used to, as if expecting a blow from behind, even in a crowd. When our eyes met, we both froze. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing someone else had survived the fall. He approached slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether I would acknowledge him. "You were there," he said, voice low. Not a question. A confirmation. "So were you," I answered. My throat tightened. There was nothing else to say, and yet everything to say. We sat on a bench down the block, away from the cameras and the congregants still talking about legacy and sainthood. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, and I didn't tell him to stop. We talked in fragmented pieces, like survivors pulling bones from rubble. He told me about the years after I ran. About Lucy, who stayed until she aged out. About Maria, who was institutionalized in her 20s after a series of breakdowns. About others, too many, whose lives became footnotes in reports no one read. I told him about the Morrisons. About becoming a social worker. About all the children I tried to save. And then I told him what I had never said aloud, not even to Sarah Chen. That I had planned to go back. That every day for a year, I carried the guilt like a second spine. That I never stopped dreaming about Lucy's last words to me. Robert didn't interrupt. He just nodded, and when I finished, he looked out toward the street and said, "I waited for someone to come. I thought maybe you would." "I wanted to," I said. I didn't know how. We sat in silence. The kind that doesn't demand anything but presence. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed at the edges. Inside was a photograph, one I remembered too well. A staged shot of children around a Christmas tree, all smiling at the camera while Mackenzie stood behind them with a hand on my shoulder. I hadn't seen that image in decades, but I remembered how it felt. How I had flinched when his hand settled there. How I had forced myself not to move. They used this photo in the newspaper, Robert said. Proof of how much he loved us. My hand trembled as I traced the edges of the image. He used everything. He nodded again. They're putting up a statue. I know. Robert looked at me then, really looked. We could say something. Together. It's not too late. For a long moment, I said nothing. I thought about the woman on the bench beside us, the girl I once was, the child in the photograph. I thought about Lucy. And Maria. And Jeremy. And the dozens whose names I never knew. And then I nodded. All right, I said. Let's talk. In the weeks that followed the memorial, the decision we made on that cold bench began to take form, awkward at first, like muscles remembering how to move after years of disuse. Robert and I met again in a small coffee shop tucked behind the public library, where no one recognized us and the tables were worn from time rather than trend. He brought a notebook filled with names and half-memories, scribbled in uneven handwriting. I brought a folder with old documents, photographs, and the letter from Mrs. Morrison I had carried for decades. We said little at first. Sometimes it was easier to sit in silence, to let the presence of someone who understood carry more weight than the words we were still learning how to say aloud. I called Sarah Chen the next day and told her everything. Not just about my decision to speak, but about Robert, about the others we suspected were still alive. She listened the way she always did, without interruption, without disbelief, without minimizing the cost of what I was preparing to do. Then she said something I hadn't thought of. You don't have to do this alone, Margaret. You shouldn't. With her help, we began reaching out. Carefully. Gently. Through letters and phone calls and, when necessary, unmarked envelopes left with quiet intermediaries. Some people didn't respond. Some had changed their names and built lives they weren't willing to risk unraveling. But others answered. First a woman named Teresa, then another named Eleanor, then a man I barely remembered named Louise who cried when I said the name, St. Catherine's. Slowly, we began to form something like a circle, fragile, hesitant, but real. Lucy was the hardest to find. Robert had known where she'd gone when she aged out, but the years had scattered her across different addresses, different jobs, different names. We traced her through public records, through archived newsletters and online obituaries that mentioned her as someone's sister or neighbor. When we finally located her, she was living 2 states away in a town I had never heard of. I didn't sleep the night before we called. My heart hammered with guilt and fear, with the weight of everything I might owe her and everything she might never want to hear from me again. She answered the phone with a cautious voice, the kind you develop after a lifetime of expecting bad news. I introduced myself slowly. There was a pause on the other end of the line, so long I thought she might have hung up. Then, I knew you'd find me one day, she said. Her voice had deepened, but the tremble was still there, the echo of a girl who once clutched a broken teddy bear and asked if this place would be good to her. I wanted to tell her everything all at once, but instead I asked if she would be willing to talk to someone about what happened to us. She said yes. Quietly, but clearly. I'm tired of pretending none of it happened. We found a journalist through one of Sarah's contacts. Her name was Maya Delgado, and she had spent years investigating institutional abuse, churches, schools, youth homes. She met us in a community center conference room, her recorder discreet, her notebook full, her eyes kind but sharp. We weren't ready for cameras or microphones or public headlines. Not yet. First, we needed to be heard by someone who believed us without hesitation. Maya listened to every word, never rushing us, never interrupting, never once asking why we had waited so long. At the end of the first meeting, she looked around the table and said, "I want you to know, you are not alone, and this story matters." Still, telling it was like tearing scar tissue from a wound you thought had closed. Every session with Maya brought up new memories, some vivid, others ghost-like. The smell of his cologne. The feel of the polished wood on his desk. The specific way he said your name before hurting you. We cried. We dissociated. We shook. But we came back. Each time, we came back. And each time, the silence loosened its grip on our lives just a little more. We met weekly, sometimes in person, sometimes over video calls with cracked audio and awkward delays. There were moments when someone would drop off the call suddenly, overwhelmed by the weight of a single sentence. We learned to wait. We learned not to rush. We learned to breathe together through the hard parts. Maya interviewed us all separately at first, then in small groups. The story that formed was not a single trauma, but a tapestry of damage, some lives shattered, others reshaped, all marked by the same man cloaked in reverence. When word leaked that the city council was proceeding with plans to unveil the bronze statue in Memorial Park, something inside me hardened. Not in rage, but in resolve. I thought of children playing beneath that statue's shadow. I thought of school field trips and civic pride and plaques that told only half a truth. We had waited decades. We would wait no longer. At our final meeting before publication, Maya laid out the story on the table, printed and bound in draft form. Names changed where requested. Facts verified. Records cited. Photographs included. She looked at us and said, "Are you ready for the world to hear you?" No one answered right away. Then Robert nodded. Then Lucy. Then Teresa. And finally, me. "Yes," I said. "It's time." The story broke on a Tuesday. Not with fireworks, not with outrage, but with a quiet unease that spread like water seeping into floorboards, slow, insistent, irreversible. The headline was simple, almost clinical: survivors allege decades of abuse at St. Catherine's Home for Children. But the faces beneath the headline, the voices quoted in the article, gave it weight. My name was there, printed without shame for the first time. Margaret Whitmore. Former resident. Former social worker. Survivor. At first, the public didn't know what to do with us. They had spent so many years enshrining Father Mackenzie as a local saint that the truth felt like an offense against memory itself. The initial comments online were predictable. "Why now? She's just trying to get attention. I don't believe it, he was a good man." But then more voices joined ours. People began writing in with their own stories, of abuse they'd witnessed, of suspicions they'd buried, of children they remembered acting strangely but never knew how to help. Former staff. Former volunteers. Even a retired nurse who said she always thought it was odd that certain children had accidents right before holidays. The tide didn't turn all at once. It shifted grain by grain, until disbelief began to erode. The city council delayed the statue ceremony. Then they cancelled it entirely. The bronze figure, already cast, was quietly moved to storage, no longer fit for public display. A plaque was added to the gates of Memorial Park instead, not with Mackenzie's name, but with a dedication to all survivors of institutional abuse. It wasn't enough, not really, but it was more than I'd ever expected. And it wasn't for him. It was for us. St. Catherine's itself had closed years earlier, but our story prompted a formal investigation into its long history. Records were subpoenaed. Whistleblowers emerged. There were whispers that Mackenzie had transferred funds to other institutions, moved certain children quietly to sister homes when they became difficult. No criminal charges could be filed against a dead man, but reputations began to splinter. A few of his defenders issued careful statements about being deeply saddened by the allegations. None of them called us liars. I gave one televised interview. Just one. I sat in a studio under hot lights and wore a pale blue blouse Mrs. Morrison had once helped me pick out for court appearances. The journalist asked me why I had waited so long. I told him the truth, that some wounds don't scab over until you see your story reflected in someone else's eyes. That silence is a form of survival when no one wants to hear the truth. That healing isn't a moment, it's a long, slow unlearning of shame. After the broadcast, I received letters. Dozens of them. Some were from strangers, others from former colleagues who had never known what I carried. A woman from my first foster case wrote to say, "Because of you, I believed my daughter when she said her teacher hurt her." An elderly man from my church, who had once shaken Mackenzie's hand with reverence, mailed me a short note that simply read, "I believe you now." That one, I tucked into the back of my drawer beside the photo of 12-year-old me. Proof that truth, even aged and weathered, still had weight. Lucy visited me the following spring. She brought a small potted plant, a peace lily, and set it on my windowsill without explanation. We sat in the garden behind my apartment building, surrounded by the faint scent of jasmine and the low hum of bees. She looked different now, gray at the temples, quiet around the eyes, but the way she held her tea with both hands was still the same. "I didn't think I'd live long enough to see people listen," she said after a while. "Me either," I said. "But here we are." We didn't talk much about the past that day. We didn't have to. Just being there, alive, in the sunlight, without apology, was enough. Before she left, Lucy hugged me tight. "You didn't abandon me," she whispered. "You gave me the only chance I had." I didn't argue. I just held her until my arms ached. In time, our group created something lasting. Not a foundation or a nonprofit, just a space. A memorial garden, small and tucked behind a local library, with stone benches and native flowers and a bronze plaque that bore no names, only the words, "For those who were never heard." And those who refused to stay silent. I go there sometimes in the mornings, when the air is still and the sun hasn't yet burned off the mist. I sit with a book or just close my eyes. I listen to birdsong and the rustle of trees and think about how far silence can stretch before it breaks. I still carry the past. I always will. But now, it doesn't carry me.